Hello. With me today is Professor Alan Ford, who's the Professor of Theology here in the University of Nottingham. Alan, over the years, has written a vast amount on Irish church history, and he's going to try and answer the question, why study Irish church history?
There are two reasons to study Irish church history. The first one is the simple fact that religion is important in Ireland. I don't think anyone would deny that. But I want to leave that just to one side for the moment. The second reason is that the study of church history in Ireland exposes many of the problems and challenges that are faced by all church historians. Ireland, in other words, is a very good test case. There's firstly the very simple and difficult problem that as a historian dealing with religion, you are dealing with something that is transcendent and claims to have absolute truth in its grasp, while you, as an historian, are dealing with the mundane, pragmatic realities of everyday history. And there is, in that contrast between the mundane and the transcendent, a tendency to reductionism. How religious historians explain religion is a perpetual struggle between taking at face value and trying to value the transcendent claims of the religion and the motivation of the religious people, and the nasty, suspicious mind of the historian who tends to ascribe motivation in a rather less idealized way. That's the first methodological problem. The other methodological problem is the classic anthropological one of the insider and the outsider. There is always a difficulty in writing religious history about your standpoint. From what perspective are you looking at the history you are studying? Are you yourself a Christian? Are you yourself a member of the particular church you are studying? If you are, that gives you valuable insights into its tradition and culture, but at the same time also challenges you to be objective in your judgments. Or are you an outsider looking at it from a very different perspective, enabling you perhaps to have a more objective viewpoint, but perhaps losing out on empathy and understanding which the insider possesses? This is a particular problem in Irish religious history because for about 400 years after the Reformation, right up until the middle of the 20th century, the way Irish religious history was written was from a distinctly insider's perspective. You were either a Catholic historian or a Protestant historian. And the kind of history that produced was, unsurprisingly, Catholic history or Protestant history, taking at face value the claims of each church and writing an appropriate religious history. This is most obvious when you look at the issue of origins. Churches are very concerned about their parentage. They want it to be legitimate. They don't want to be heretical bastards. And therefore historians in a particular church have a very important role to play of giving that church genealogical legitimacy by tracing it back to the earliest possible times when, of course, Christianity was at its purest. And this can be seen in Irish religious history in the way in which both Catholic and Protestant churches in Ireland trace their origins back to that crucial, supposedly founding figure of Irish Christianity, St. Patrick, in the early 5th century.
If he were in the if he did exist in the early 5th century. But the interesting thing from my perspective is that whether you follow back the Protestant view of Patrick or the Catholic view of Patrick, you get back to a very episcopal figure who is as orthodox as the bishops of those churches today. And yet, of course, they conveniently ignore that Patrick himself was seen by the bishops of the time as the outsider, as the heretical figure.
Patrick had certain problems with the bishops of the time, as he relates. That there is, I think, a great tendency in the history of the churches in Ireland to read back their present situation into the past. And that's one of the great problems of the fact that Irish church history has been written by insiders. And I think this is where we need to explore a little bit more the transition which took place in the, roughly speaking, the middle of the 20th century, when we moved from religious history being a product of insiders, an attempt to define and defend the legitimacy of each church, to a much more fluid and interesting situation. This was a product of the professionalisation of Irish history. As Irish history moved into the universities, out from the seminaries, if you like, into the universities, as the founding fathers of Irish historical studies, Robin Dudley Edwards and Theo Moody, attempted to create a scientific study of Irish history, which now seems a little bit dated, but at the time was quite an extraordinary venture. And this produced the possibility of Irish religious history being written by people who were not within the tradition, people who weren't even maybe within Ireland, and led to a renewed interest in exploring alternative methodological approaches to religious history in Ireland.
Whenever the historian speaks to a group of any religion, there are two elements. The first thing is the historian is seen as somehow being the nasty person who relativizes. And the second thing is the historian is the one who brings up the awkward historical fact. And one awkward historical fact can often seem to torpedo an entire empire of opinion and theological certainty. Perhaps you could address the idea that the historian is the nasty relativist?
I think one of the achievements of the modern Irish university system has been to create a cadre of religious historians who are willing to ask those awkward questions. There is no doubt in my mind that we are now much more questioning in our approach to issues such as the continuity of Catholic piety. We are beginning to become, we are acutely aware that it changed over time, that what we think of in modern terms as the unique devotion of the Irish people to the Catholic Church and their unique piety and record of church attendance was apparently a creation of the mid-19th century. That kind of willingness to challenge established pieties is, I think, very much a product of the freeing of Irish church history from its confessional limitations in the beginning of the 20th century. The difficulty, of course, that we now face is that the context within which Irish history works has changed again with the pronounced secularization of Irish society in the latter part of the 20th century. And we now face interesting challenges of how you write Irish religious history for a country that may be becoming post-Catholic.
You mentioned the two founding fathers, and you mentioned Theo Moody and Robin Dudley Edwards. I, first year undergraduate, there was almost a hush spread over the lecture hall when Professor Edwards came in to lecture us. And indeed, I still have a letter from him, which I kept as a sacred relic. I take it. I happen to know you actually see yourself as the disciple of T.O. Moody.
But I wouldn't say that. He was the most boring lecturer I ever encountered. I would hope I don't follow on his footsteps
All
there.
right, all right.
But I was a product of a more Protestant institution, Trinity College Dublin, and of course was taught by Theo Moody. But the interesting thing there, I think, is that in both cases we can actually place them in a specific religious tradition. That the assumption that you can be scientific in your study of history is a bogus one. There is no such thing as absolute objectivity. And one of the continuing challenges for the post-Catholic, if you like, Irish religious historian is what methodological standpoint do you take when approaching religious history?
And that's, well, the reason I raised the question that I started my career in UCD, and Robin Dudley Edwards was then the chief guru, was that the historian themselves, each of us as historians, we have to realize that we are actually located within our own history.
Yes. And I think that is what makes Irish religious history so exciting, that you are located in a powerful, vibrant, argumentative religious tradition or religious traditions. That's why being an Irish religious historian is so exciting.
Alan, thank you very much.